Hellcat pilots walked through the Pacific meat grinder. But the real butcher wasn't the enemy. It was the lethal arrogance of Washington. Within mere months, this cabinet overconfidence would mutate into an absolute slaughter over Pearl Harbor. An American aviator locks eyes with a sleek, unfamiliar silhouette. He yanks the control stick hard. He forces his heavy fighter into a desperate, evasive turn. Nothing works. The alien machine effortlessly cuts off his escape. Absolute helplessness floods the cockpit. The choking stench of burning aviation fuel rolls over the Pacific waves. Men were burning alive. How did the best army in the world end up completely blind? American intelligence simply dismissed early enemy successes as Chinese incompetence. The A6M Zero had been slaughtering opposition since August 1940. Japanese pilots shredded Soviet-built interceptors over Chongqing, but desk officers ignored the blood. They assumed the empire flew fragile, outdated junk. America stepped into the arena with its eyes closed. Young boys paid the price. Japanese forces seized total air supremacy almost overnight. The survival math was brutally simple. Out of 560 Allied aircraft defending the Pacific theater, the Zero exterminated exactly 470. 84%. Those 470 slaughtered crews did not simply fall to superior tactics. They died facing a Mitsubishi machine built on a terrifying philosophy. The designers consciously traded human lives for absolute maneuverability. Engineers stripped every redundant ounce of metal from the frame. The goal was pure offense. They packed the wings with devastating firepower. 2 20mm cannons, 2 7.7mm machine guns. You expect a fighter bristling with heavy weapons to be a shielded beast of war. The reality was a paper-thin shell completely devoid of armor. No steel plates, no self-sealing fuel tanks. The metal was unnervingly fragile. Boarding the aircraft, a pilot would press his leather boot against the exterior and hear an eerie metallic crunch. The fuselage literally dented under a human step. Mitsubishi creators understood this brutal math perfectly. A single incendiary bullet meant an inescapable fiery grave. The design left the man completely naked in the sky, but they deemed physical protection a flaw. Agility was the only shield. They built a flying coffin, engineered to slaughter the enemy at any cost. The Japanese High Command reviewed the blueprints of this lethal trap and officially authorized the compromise. While Tokyo stamped out their flawless killers, Grumman engineers coasted on a sluggish upgrade. They had no idea this routine project would soon mutate into a frantic race against death. What forced a slow-moving bureau to achieve the impossible? The brutal realization that every day of delay cost dozens of lives. Engineers drafted the initial sketches back in 1938, a modest successor, no urgency. But then the Pacific theater became a meat grinder. Combat reports screamed of shattered canopies and burning cockpits. The design bureau woke up to a nightmare. The home front had to urgently stop the extermination of American pilots. Almost 4 years of calm development collapsed into 22 days of feverish redesigns. 22 days to completely overhaul a combat airframe. In military aviation, such massive structural changes take months. Forcing this timeline demanded a suicidal pace, but choice did not exist. Draftsmen slept on concrete floors, pencils snapped. Engineers hammered every bloody lesson from the front lines directly into the prototype F6F. They stopped building a standard fighter. They started forging a flying vault. By late June 1942, the drastically altered machine finally ripped through the sky. 4 months remained until the first production model. His victory report read like an obituary. Commander John Thatch had just helped win the Battle of Midway. But his assessment of the F4F Wildcat was bitter and merciless. The American fighter was pitifully inferior in climb, maneuverability, and speed. Grumman's fresh blueprints could not shield his pilots today. Until the new planes arrived, Thatch had to keep his men alive with a gesture of pure despair. The Wildcat weighed almost a ton more than the Japanese Zero. Pulling the stick back to outclimb the enemy was physically impossible. Gravity and momentum heavily favored the Japanese. Thatch refused to just stand by and watch his squadron burn. Alone at his desk, he nervously pushed small wooden plane models across the flat surface, sliding them, crossing their paths. He manipulated the tiny fighters over and over, desperately searching for a blind spot in an invincible machine. He found only one. The maneuver became known as the Thatch Weave. It was not a display of tactical dominance. It was a suicide pact turned into strategy. Two American fighters flew in a wide parallel formation. When a Zero locked onto one tail, the hunted pilot did not run. He became live bait. He and his wingman violently turned toward each other. The intersecting paths dragged the pursuing Zero directly into the blazing guns of the second Wildcat. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the briefing room. Young pilots stared at the chalk lines on the board. They understood the grim mechanics perfectly. To kill the enemy, one of them had to deliberately fly straight under the executioner's blade. They had to offer their own cockpit as a target. They had no other choice. John Thatch's desperate weave only bought them time, a temporary stay of execution. The real salvation came not from an American drawing board, but from the freezing swamps of the Aleutian Islands. Through the dense fog, a dark silhouette broke the flat landscape, an intact enemy fighter, upside down, swallowed by the soft, saving mud. It was June 1942, Akutan Island. The treacherous ground had snagged the landing gear, flipping the aircraft violently onto its back. Heavy, freezing mud squelched under the boots of the American recovery team as they pried open the canopy. Inside the trapped cockpit hung Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga. His neck was snapped, dead on impact. The young pilot perished, but his legendary machine remained perfectly intact. A ghost in the dirt, an absolute goldmine for Allied intelligence. They carefully extracted the airframe from the muck, brought the prize home, repaired it. Why risk test pilots' lives for an enemy aircraft? To find the speed at which the perfect machine kills itself. The autopsy of the Zero revealed a grim philosophy, lethal but fatally flawed. American engineers discovered the Japanese designers omitted flight control hydraulics entirely. They traded human safety for sheer maneuverability. At cruising speeds, the Zero was a dancer. In a steep dive, it became a tomb. Without hydraulics, the rushing airflow pressed against the control surfaces with crushing force. The aircraft physically fought against the muscles of its own pilot. The flight stick turned to concrete. To pull out of a high-speed dive, a man needed inhuman strength. Up in the thin air of extreme altitudes, the nightmare only deepened as the engine choked and performance plummeted. But the ultimate vulnerability hid in the velocity. Pushed past 200 miles per hour, the lightweight wings began to shake violently. Past 300 miles per hour, the unassisted controls locked entirely. Thatch's bloody combat reports and the frozen secrets of the captured Zero forged one absolute realization: America would not build a copy. They refused to play the enemy's game. Instead of matching the Zero's fragile grace, engineers bolted on a monster. The Pratt & Whitney double wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower. When the cylinders fired, the deafening roar shook the tarmac. It wasn't just mechanical noise, it was the sound of raw, saving power. Japan treated its aviators like disposable components. Fast, lethal, condemned. Grumman chose another path. Flesh and blood mattered more than pure aerodynamics. A dead ace could not be replaced. Training a boy to fly took months. Losing him took seconds. So they stopped chasing perfect agility. They refused to build a suicide machine. They traded rapid climb rates for pilot survival. They sacrificed grace for weight. Engineers packed the airframe with heavy steel plates. They sewed thick armor straight into the fuselage, deliberately defying the sacred laws of aerodynamic purity. The combat doctrine shifted. Instead of turning with the enemy, pilots would rely on brutal dive tactics, strike and vanish. The massive engine delivered the ultimate trump card. A top speed advantage of 60 miles per hour, permanently rewrote the rules of aerial combat. That brute force engineering immediately translated into absolute psychological armor. What does a pilot feel, knowing there is a wall of metal behind his back? He feels invincible. 212 pounds of solid steel, the exact weight of a heavy adult man, bolted securely directly behind the pilot. A silent guardian meant to take the ultimate punishment. A dull, heavy thud echoes through the tight cabin. Bullets bite and stick into the thick plate, stopping mere inches from a young aviator's skull. He survives. He breathes. He keeps flying. Across the Pacific, doomed Japanese veterans burned alive inside paper-thin airframes. American boys went to war operating flying tanks. Survival dictated every structural compromise. The engineers deliberately stripped away the sleek, panoramic plexiglass windscreen. It offered a beautiful, uninterrupted view of the horizon, but aesthetic curves could not deflect shrapnel. They bolted in a crude, flat panel of heavy armored glass instead. Unrestricted vision meant absolutely nothing if the aviator was dead. The Grumman Iron Works built machines to bring men home. The pilot sits safely behind that flat glass shield. He pushes the throttle forward. Return fire strikes his wings. A heavy round violently pierces the wing structure. It tears straight into the gas supply. But there is no catastrophic fireball. The self-sealing fuel tanks react instantly. The raw rubber lining swells upon contact with the aviation gas. The lethal breach physically chokes itself shut. The leak stops dead before a spark can even catch. Secure inside his impenetrable shell, the operator becomes the executioner. 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns roar to life in the wings. The American aviator squeezes the trigger, and a relentless storm of heavy lead violently shreds the fragile enemy fuselage into burning splinters. While 212 pounds of steel armor saved lives in the dogfights, Grumman's stow-wing mechanism allowed the Navy to pack its carriers with an inexhaustible swarm of these machines. The fleet had other options. The Corsair was faster, but it was a widowmaker, a strict, brutal killer. It slaughtered so many panicked rookies during pitching deck landings that aviators branded it the Ensign Eliminator. The Hellcat was different. It forgave. It submitted. When a terrified 19-year-old botched a crosswind approach, the aircraft covered his flaws. Low stall speed, clear aerodynamic warnings, immediate spin recovery. The machine simply refused to kill its master. Kids fresh out of flight school could push the airframe to the absolute edge without fear. Then came the logistics. The harsh metallic screech of the stow-wing mechanism echoed across cramped, wind-swept decks. Heavy wings folded back flush against the fuselage. A single carrier could suddenly cram dozens of these fighters into its belly. Mass production of survival. This docile handling and structural compactness turned out to be just as devastating to the Japanese Empire as heavy machine guns. The final execution happened in the vertical plane. The Hellcat's massive supercharging system unlocked the freezing, thin air of the upper atmosphere. American teenagers dictated the rules of engagement. They climbed high. They plunged from the clouds, fired, and zoomed back into the stratosphere. The Japanese Zero could not reach that same elevation without a severe loss of engine power. 16 destroyed Japanese fighters, 0 American casualties. Thousands of pilots launching from cramped carrier decks had craved this exact revenge since the tragic surrender of 1941. On October 5, 1943, the Hellcats finally delivered the payback over Wake Island. Why did the Japanese not expect the strike? The dogfight erupted below 12,000 feet, the exact altitude where the Mitsubishi ruled as the absolute god of maneuverable combat. Old rules guaranteed a swift Imperial victory. Then 48 Hellcats plummeted from the clouds. They smashed directly into 23 patrolling Zeros. Close-quarters chaos consumed the air. Japanese veterans violently yanked their control sticks. They dragged their aircraft into desperate, tight turns. But the heavy American fighters simply followed them through every vicious maneuver. Tracers sawed through unarmored wings. The The thick stench of burning aviation fuel choked the ocean wind. 16 flaming airframes spiraled into the water. 16-0 in one single battle. The Americans fought on enemy turf. They played by Japanese rules. They flew away without losing a single man. The psychological shock permanently broke the Imperial aviators. The Pacific's apex predators instantly transformed into helpless prey. The Zero's dominance ended forever. While American pilots celebrated the slaughter over Wake Island, panic consumed the drawing boards in Tokyo. Mitsubishi engineers frantically tried to resuscitate a dying fleet. They ripped out the old machine guns. They bolted heavier 20mm cannons onto the wings. But the upgrade was a death trap. Firepower meant absolutely nothing without basic protection. By 1943, self-sealing fuel tanks were the strict baseline for survival in the West. Japan lacked the resources to build them. The empire's aviation industry was suffocating. Factories could not produce a new generation of fighters. Instead, high command forced their boys to fly paper-thin coffins. The structural doom was inescapable. A single short burst from a Hellcat shattered the Japanese fighter. The unarmored frame snapped. The volatile fuel ignited. Men burned alive before they ever hit the ocean. The Americans fought a completely different war. The Hellcat absorbed unimaginable punishment. Even when a riddled aircraft plummeted from the sky, the massive armored tub protected the boy inside. A shattered Hellcat slammed hard into a steel carrier deck. The landing gear collapsed. The fuselage screamed and tore apart. But the pilot simply unbuckled his harness, pushed back the canopy, and walked away. Japanese aviators finally realized they were trapped in a nightmare. A veteran could still outmaneuver the heavy American machine. He lined up the perfect shot. He emptied every gun at point-blank range into the enemy tail. The American fighter just kept flying. Desperate cannon bursts from the Mitsubishi tore through empty air. Hellcat pilots dictated the terms of engagement. They forced a monstrous, suffocating pace. How do you execute a vastly more maneuverable enemy? The Americans simply banned themselves from slowing down. They pushed the throttle. They dragged the fight past 300 miles per hour. At that velocity, physics betrayed the Japanese. Inside the Zero cockpit, the manual control column turned to solid concrete. The cables stiffened under the crushing airstream. The Japanese pilot hauled on the lever with his entire body, fighting the monstrous resistance, but the nimble hunter barely shifted. Above 275 miles per hour, paralysis gripped the legendary fighter. Dogfights naturally bleed momentum. Sharp maneuvers burn velocity. Over time, the dials inevitably wind down. The Japanese veteran waited for this decay. The American pilot watched for it too. The moment his airspeed began to plummet, the Hellcat refused the turn. He tore away. He severed the distance in a straight line. No tight loops. No honorable duels. Just cold mechanical execution. If the enemy chased, he flew directly into a trap set by a wingman. If he broke off, the American reset his altitude and prepared a fresh high-speed pass. The aerial ballet died. The United States Navy shattered the very concept of maneuvering combat, rendering the famous Japanese turning advantage completely useless. They left their enemy with only one impossible condition for survival. The needle had to drop below 200 miles per hour. While the Hellcat shredded Japanese planes at 300 miles per hour, the true killer waited an ocean away. 1,300 American pilots perished without seeing a single enemy. A rookie pushed the throttle forward on a Texas runway. The massive engine roared. The heavy fighter lifted into a safe civilian sky. Then came a stalled wing. A panicked jerk of the stick. The machine plummeted. A crushed cockpit. Investigators found no bullet holes in the armor. They heard only the eerie silence of a shattered fuselage, thousands of miles from the nearest anti-aircraft gun. The industrial conveyor belt demanded blood. Massive hubs like Corpus Christi pumped out aviators by the tens of thousands. The sheer scale of this system turned the lives of inexperienced teenagers into a calculated logistical margin of error. Routine ferry operations became a silent meat grinder. Young men with minimal flight hours navigated 4-ton beasts across the country through crosswinds and blinding storms. The final ledger erased the romance of the dogfight. The Navy lost 2,460 Hellcats across the entire war. Japanese fighters shot down exactly 270. Anti-aircraft batteries claimed 550. Basic training and delivery flights shattered 53% of all lost machines. A routine ground strike turned a pilot's life into Russian roulette. Training flights offered the exact same odds. Who helps if you misjudge a low-level pass? You are completely alone. In a single-seat fighter, there is no instructor. Forget the romanticized dogfights. The true psychological horror lived below. Strafing Japanese airfields meant diving straight down into a meat grinder. The pilot pushes the stick forward. The dirt runway fills the glowing gun sight. He holds the crosshairs perfectly steady while plunging directly into the firing line. The deafening roar of the radial engine entirely drowns out the violent impacts. Heavy enemy bullets relentlessly hammer against the Hellcat's armor. The earth rushes up. He pulls the stick back. A fully armed Hellcat weighed over 4 tons. Wrenching that colossal mass of steel out of a screaming dive just feet above the ground demanded immense physical strength. Gravity ripped at the wings. Physics itself became the primary enemy. Then came the desperate climb. The heavy fighter labored upward. A suffocating curtain of anti-aircraft fire hung directly over the base. Searing black flak bursts and intersecting red tracers turned the sky into torn rags. Every single gun barrel on the ground tracked the climbing plane. The pilot simply had to grip the controls and fly blindly through the exploding steel. If the engine choked, the flight ended in the ocean. The carrier deck remained miles away. That is exactly why lifeguard destroyers permanently shadowed the task force. They trailed far behind the massive ships. Their only mission was fishing out the broken men who lost their battle against gravity or shrapnel. They just drifted and waited. But even after tearing through the wall of flak over Japanese airfields, the pilot faced the ultimate nightmare: returning to the deck. Night carrier landings terrified men far more than actual dogfights. During the Second World War, the ship drifted as a tiny, invisible speck in the massive Pacific abyss. There were no modern landing aids, no angled flight decks to offer a second chance, just a straight, unforgiving strip of solid steel. You missed the wire, you died. A fighter either smashed directly into parked squadrons or plunged over the edge into the Black Ocean. Survival depended entirely on one man, the landing signal officer. He stood exposed at the absolute edge of the drop. His fluorescent paddles violently slashed through the pitch black. A desperate mechanical ballet. The pilot stared into the void, trusting those glowing streaks to guide 4 tons of descending metal. The claustrophobia inside the cramped canopy choked the pilot. Yet the early Hellcat models carried a fatal flaw. The rubber failed. Exhausted men brought their heavy fighters down too fast. The tires simply blew out under the extreme friction. A ruptured tire instantly collapsed the landing gear, killing the pilot in a massive, uncontrollable crash on the bare deck. The price of a blown tire or the slightest mistake over the deck of the USS Enterprise came down to seconds. A legendary photograph captured this exact cost. Lieutenant Walter Lewis Tuning stepped directly onto a leaking, blazing fuel tank. He reached into the fire. He pulled Ensign Byron Milton Johnson from a doomed Hellcat. Johnson caught the arresting wire on his 3rd emergency attempt, but the aircraft slammed into the deck. The port landing gear collapsed and plunged into the steel catwalk. The heavy airframe crashed down on its belly. Why did the pilot remain locked inside the burning machine? The hard impact completely jammed the cockpit canopy. Johnson pushed against the glass. The metal refused to move. He had no way out. The engine kept running. The propeller kept spinning. Steel blades screeched against the deck armor. A massive shower of bright sparks erupted around the nose. Beneath the crushed fuselage hung a standard drop tank holding 150 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. The friction tore the metal open. Raw gasoline poured directly into the sparks. The stuck aircraft instantly became a ticking time bomb. Flames swallowed the cockpit. The heat melted the paint. Johnson ran out of time. Then tuning broke protocol. He ignored the lethal risk, climbed onto the burning tank, and dragged the trapped ensign from the inferno. They survived, but the fleet learned a brutal lesson. Fighter ace Butch O'Hare recommended a strict new procedure to prevent another disaster. Every returning pilot dropped their external fuel tanks into the ocean before touching the flight deck.
A pilot could drop his external tank perfectly, but missing the flight deck meant the ocean awaited him. Engineers designed the Hellcat for absolute dominance in the clouds. Hitting the waves, the fighter became a hopeless death trap. A heavy nose and low air scoops guaranteed a violent impact. The aircraft flipped immediately upon touching the water. Metal sheared. The fuselage tore apart in seconds. Flyers almost never risked a water landing, choosing to bail out and trust their silk parachutes over a sinking cockpit. By late 1944, the vast Pacific became a nameless grave. The ocean floor claimed thousands of planes falling just a couple of miles short of the carrier. But the crushing water below was only half the nightmare. The sky above was changing. In late 1944, the Japanese military shifted tactics. The enemy stopped planning for the flight home. The kamikaze emerged. The legendary Zero stopped being a mere dogfighter. Enemy flyers turned it into a manned bomb, a suicide weapon diving straight for the American fleet. Hellcat pilots stood as the only shield against this madness. They had to intercept the strikes and shred the incoming planes before impact. But the suicide waves slipped under radar screens. They dropped from the blinding sun without warning. American airmen found themselves completely cornered. Above them flew men eager to die. Below them waited a merciless, swallowing ocean. There were no safe zones. To intercept kamikaze strikes in late 1944, the fleet required more than just a flawless aircraft. They needed a predictable one. Why did the machine of victory turn out not to be the fastest fighter? The secret lay in the simplicity of piloting. Look at the blueprints. The Hellcat was not the absolute apex of American fighters. Its rival, the F4U Corsair, completely dominated the engineering sheets. The Corsair delivered a superior roll rate. It generated a vastly higher climb rate. On paper, the aircraft was a masterpiece of raw performance. But paper metrics do not survive the Pacific. The Hellcat won the sky through the pilot's hands. While the heavier Corsair demanded exhausting physical exertion just to hold a steady bank, a Hellcat pilot felt immediate, reassuring lightness in the control stick. The machine reacted to a simple flick of the wrist. It was sharp. It forgave clumsy mistakes. It did not try to stall and kill its operator during a tight turn. Total war demanded volume. Factories stamped out these predictable machines by the thousands. Young recruits learned to master them in weeks, keeping the carrier decks fully stocked with confident aviators. Simple handling defeated dry horsepower numbers. 19-1. Pilots logged this exact kill ratio against the premier fighters of the empire. Some analysts claimed 13-1, but the burning wreckage proved absolute dominance. That predictable handling transformed aerial combat into an industrial-scale slaughter. The Hellcat wiped out more Japanese aircraft than all Corsairs combined. The P-38 Lightning trailed far behind. June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The largest aircraft carrier clash in human history. The sky over the Marianas choked on falling metal. American pilots stopped dogfighting. They just executed. The radio crackled continuously with static and greedy voices. Squadrons methodically divided incoming targets through the interference. Men hunted machines like wild game. Air supremacy became absolute. 275 destroyed Japanese aircraft against a miserable 15 lost. That single day amputated the enemy fleet. Losing those 275 planes and hours forever eradicated the offensive potential of Japanese carrier aviation.
Decades of Imperial doctrine vanished in the dark water. The Empire lost its veteran aviators. Japan ran out of time. The simple fighter finalized the destruction. The ultimate count of downed enemy machines froze at 5,223.